Dust choked Wynn's throat as she cradled her wailing infant, left behind in a brutal Wyoming wasteland with nothing but a dry canteen. She was supposed to be a quiet feast for circling buzzards. Fortunately, destiny hadn't planned on a lone, hardened drover named Clove Thornton riding into her nightmare. The year was 1878, and the sprawling expanse of the Wyoming Territory was as unforgiving as a judge's gavel. It was a land that promised salvation to the desperate, but often delivered only a shallow, unmarked grave. Wynn Miller, a woman of 22 with dirt-smudged cheeks and eyes the color of bruised thunderclouds, was quickly realizing that her husband's promises were as empty as the landscape stretching out before them. Josiah Miller was a man built of hollow charm and bad habits. When he had courted Wynn back in Ohio, he spoke of sprawling ranches and cattle grazing on sweet green grass. But the reality was a busted-down Studebaker wagon, a string of unpaid gambling debts, and a desperate flight westward to escape men who preferred collecting their dues in blood. Josiah wasn't looking for a homestead. He was running from a reckoning. They had veered off the main emigrant trail 3 days prior, taking what Josiah swore was a shortcut through the desolate stretch known to locals as the Devil's Cutoff. In truth, he had spotted riders on the horizon, men wearing the dusty grey dusters favored by Dutch Higgins enforcers. The ruthless gang Josiah had cheated out of $3,000 in a rigged faro game in Cheyenne. The breakdown happened just past noon. The wagon's front axle snapped like a dry twig under the brutal heat, pitching the wagon sideways into a dry ravine. Wynn had been thrown into the canvas siding, clutching her 3-month-old son, Samuel, to her chest to shield him from the impact. When the dust settled, she looked to her husband for a plan. Instead, she saw the frantic, wild look of a trapped animal in Josiah's eyes. He didn't speak a word of comfort. He didn't check on little Samuel, whose cries were piercing the heavy, stagnant air. Josiah simply unhitched the 2 draft horses, throwing a makeshift saddle over the stronger roan. "Josiah." "What are you doing?" Wynn had asked, her voice raspy from dehydration. "We need to fix the axle. We need to find water." Josiah didn't look at her. He couldn't. "They're coming. Abby, Higgins's men. If they find me, they'll kill me. If they find us all together, they'll kill us all. You can't leave us here," she screamed, the horrific reality dawning on her as he mounted the horse. "We have no water. Samuel will die." "Someone will come along." Josiah lied, his voice trembling as he spurred the horse. "I'll lead them away. I'll come back for you." He never looked back. The second horse followed him, spooked by his sudden departure, leaving Wynn entirely alone in an ocean of sagebrush and cracking alkali mud. For 2 days, Wynn fought a war against the sun. She rationed the last few drops of water in the canteen for Samuel, wetting the corner of a rag and letting the infant suckle the moisture. She fashioned a crude lean-to out of the collapsed wagon canvas to shield them from the blistering midday heat. But by the afternoon of the second day, her milk had dried up entirely from severe dehydration. Samuel's cries had weakened to a breathless, heart-wrenching whimper. Wynn lay beneath the canvas, her lips cracked and bleeding, her skin burning with fever. She curled her body over her baby, offering her own shadow as a final, desperate shield. She watched the black specks of turkey vultures begin to circle lazily in the cloudless blue sky. As the edges of her vision began to darken, she whispered a broken prayer, asking not for her own salvation, but for her son's. And then she slipped into the suffocating blackness. She didn't hear the heavy, rhythmic thud of hooves or the creak of wooden wheels. Clove Thornton was a man who preferred the silence of the plains to the chatter of men. At 34, he bore the rugged, weather-beaten look of a man who had spent his life in the saddle. A former trail boss from Texas, Clove had seen enough death to last 3 lifetimes, the most devastating being the loss of his own wife and daughter to cholera 5 years prior. Since then, he kept his head down, hauling freight across the most dangerous routes in the territory because the isolation suited his hollowed-out soul. He was driving a supply wagon toward Fort Laramie when his lead mule abruptly halted, its ears pinning back. Clove squinted through the heat haze, a mile off the trail, tucked into a dry wash. He saw the splintered remains of a wagon, and above it, the telltale spiral of buzzards. Clove drew his Winchester rifle, his eyes scanning the horizon for Apache raiders or road agents. Seeing nothing but the shimmering heat, he nudged his team forward. When he reached the wreckage, the smell of death hadn't yet settled, but the stillness was absolute. He dismounted, his boots crunching on the dry earth, and pulled back the collapsed canvas. The sight made his breath catch in his throat. A woman lay in the dirt, her clothes stiff with dust and dried sweat, but it was what she was holding that made Clove drop his rifle. Tucked beneath her, shielded by her frail body, was a bundle of rags. And from that bundle came a sound so faint Clove almost mistook it for the wind, a tiny, raspy gasp. "Lord Almighty," Clove murmured. He fell to his knees, gently rolling the woman onto her back. She was entirely unresponsive, her pulse a fluttery, terrifyingly weak rhythm against his calloused fingertips. He quickly unwrapped the baby. The infant was lethargic, skin terrifyingly pale, lips cracked. Clove didn't waste a second. He ran to his wagon, grabbing his largest canteen and a clean tin cup. He poured a small amount of water over his bandana. Returning to the baby, with agonizing patience, he squeezed single drops of water past the infant's lips, waiting for the natural swallowing reflex to kick in. After a terrifying minute, the baby swallowed, then again, leaving the child momentarily in the shade of his own wagon. Clove returned to the woman. He lifted Wynn's head, trickling water onto her cracked lips. She didn't wake, but she instinctively swallowed. She was too weak to ride a horse, and the baby wouldn't survive another day in this heat. Clove cleared a space in the back of his freight wagon, laying down a bed of soft flour sacks and his own heavy wool blankets. He lifted Wynn, surprised by how incredibly light she felt, like a hollowed-out bird, and placed her in the wagon bed. He nestled the baby safely beside her. As he climbed onto the buckboard, Clove looked at the tracks leading away from the wrecked wagon. He was an expert tracker. He saw the deep indentations of 2 horses leaving in a hurry. Someone had survived this wreck. Someone had mounted up and ridden away, leaving a woman and a child to burn. Clove's jaw tightened, a cold, unfamiliar fury igniting in his chest. He snapped the reins, steering his team back toward the main trail. He didn't know who this woman was, but he knew the monsters that walked this frontier, and he knew, with grim certainty, that this story was far from over. For 3 days, the freight wagon was a rolling infirmary. Clove pushed his mules hard, traveling by the light of the silvery moon to spare Wynn and the baby from the punishing daytime sun. During the heat of the day, they camped in the shadows of rocky outcroppings, where Clove fought a desperate, hourly battle to keep them alive. Wynn drifted in and out of a fevered delirium. She muttered names Clove didn't know, pleading with a man named Josiah, screaming about the horses, sobbing for her mother. Clove sat by her side, pressing cool, damp cloths to her forehead. He fed the baby, whom he had taken to calling Little Man, with a makeshift bottle crafted from a leather glove with a pinhole poked in the finger, filled with a mixture of canned, condensed milk and water he carried in his provisions. It was on the evening of the 4th day, camped near the trickling waters of the Sweetwater River, that Wynne finally opened her eyes to the world of the living. The first thing she saw was a canvas roof swaying gently in the breeze. The scent of wood smoke and brewing coffee filled her nostrils. Panic seized her instantly. She bolted upright, her weakened muscles screaming in protest. "Samuel!" she gasped, her voice sounding like grinding stones. "Easy now, Mom." A deep, steady voice rumbled from the back of the wagon. Wynne flinched, pulling the blanket to her chin as a large silhouette blocked out the campfire light. Clove climbed into the wagon bed, holding a tin cup. Beside him, in a wooden crate padded with blankets, lay Samuel, sleeping soundly, his color restored to a healthy pink. Wynne let out a fractured sob, scrambling over the flour sacks to reach into the crate. She pulled the baby to her chest, burying her face in his soft, sparse hair, weeping uncontrollably. Clove waited, giving her the space to let the terror wash out of her. When her tears finally slowed, he offered her the tin cup. "Drink this. It's broth. You need your strength." Wynne looked up at him. She saw the scar cutting through his left eyebrow, the rough stubble on his jaw, and the quiet, assessing intelligence in his grey eyes. "Who are you?" she asked, her hands trembling as she took the cup. "Clove Thornton. Found you a few days back off the cutoff. You were about an hour away from shaking hands with St. Peter." Wynne drank the broth, the warm liquid sending a shock of life through her starved system. As the memories flooded back the broken axle, Josiah's panicked eyes, the sound of the horses galloping away, a deep, humiliating flush crept up her neck. "My husband," she started, unable to look Clove in the eye. "I saw the tracks." Clove interrupted gently, sparing her the indignity of having to explain the abandonment. "2 horses rode out, left you with nothing." "He was scared," Wynne whispered, though the defense sounded hollow even to her own ears. "Men were chasing him. Bad men. Only kind of men out here, Ma'am," Clove said, striking a match on his boot heel to light a cigarillo. "But a man who leaves his blood behind ain't much of a man at all. What's your name?" "Wynne. Wynne Miller. And this is Samuel." Over the next 2 days, an uneasy but profound rhythm developed between them. As Wynne regained her strength, she took over the care of Samuel, though she watched with quiet amazement as Clove, this hardened, imposing drover, handled the infant with surprising tenderness when he thought she wasn't looking. She saw the ghosts in his eyes, the way he stared into the campfire at night like he was looking for faces in the flames. They reached a small, remote way station known as Miller's Hollow, no relation to Josiah. Clove paid the station master for fresh supplies and a safe room for Wynne to properly bathe and rest. It was inside this dusty, timber-framed room that the world shattered all over again. Wynne was sitting on the edge of a lumpy mattress, unwrapping Samuel from the heavy, oilcloth-lined quilt Josiah had insisted they use to swaddle him before the crash. She had always hated the quilt. It was strangely stiff and smelled of stale tobacco. But out in the desert, it had been the only thing thick enough to block the sun. As she pulled the fabric away, she noticed a jagged tear in the inner lining, right along the thickest seam. Something rough and green was protruding from the cotton batting. Frowning, Wynne tugged at the green paper. It didn't pull free easily. She grabbed a pair of sewing shears from her bag and snipped the stitching. She gasped, her hand flying to her mouth to stifle a scream. Spilling out of the lining of the baby's quilt were tightly bound stacks of United States Treasury notes. Hundreds of them. Thousands. Nestled beneath the cash were a heavy gold pocket watch and a folded piece of parchment that looked like a property deed. Her heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. Josiah hadn't just been running from gambling debts. This was stolen money, stagecoach money, or bank money. And suddenly, the horrifying truth clicked into place with the sickening sound of a loaded gun cylinder. Josiah hadn't abandoned them in a blind panic. He had deliberately left the money hidden in his infant son's blanket because he knew Higgins' men would search him if they caught him. If he was caught, he would claim he was broke. He left Wynne and Samuel as unknowing, stationary mules, assuming they would wait by the wagon. He planned to lead the posse away, lose them in the canyons, and double back to collect his prize. He didn't just leave them to die. He had used their very survival as a gamble to protect his stolen fortune. "Clove!" Wynne screamed, clutching the baby to her chest as if the quilt itself had caught fire. Clove burst through the door, his Colt revolver drawn, his eyes scanning the room for threats. What is it?" Wynne couldn't speak. She just pointed with a trembling finger to the bed. Clove slowly lowered his gun, walking over to the pile of currency spilling from the blood-stained, dirt-crusted quilt. He picked up a stack of bills, his thumb running over the crisp edges. He picked up the folded parchment, unfolding it to reveal a deed to a sprawling tract of land in Montana, stolen from a murdered cattle baron just 3 weeks prior, a story Clove had heard, whispered in every saloon from Cheyenne to Laramie. "Wynne," Clove said, his voice dropping to a dangerous, gravelly whisper. "Where did your husband get this? I didn't know," she sobbed, backing away from the bed. "I swear to God, Clove, I didn't know. He told me he wrapped Samuel up to keep him warm before he left." Clove stared at the money, the pieces of the puzzle snapping together in his mind. The tracks at the wagon wreck, the desperate flight. He wasn't running just to save his own skin, Clove said, turning to look at her, his eyes dark with a sudden, terrifying realization. He hid the loot, and the men hunting him. They ain't just looking for him anymore. If they caught him, and he talked. Before Clove could finish the thought, the distinct, sharp crack of a rifle echoed from the ridge overlooking the way station. The small window of the room shattered, spraying glass across the floorboards. Josiah hadn't died in the desert, and he hadn't come back alone. The shattering of the window was a violent explosion of sound and glass. Before Wynne could even register the spray of jagged shards raining across the floorboards, Clove had crossed the room in a blur of motion. He hit her with the solid weight of his shoulder, driving her and the baby down to the hard wooden floor, just as a second rifle shot tore through the thin timber wall, passing exactly where her chest had been a second before. "Stay down, keep the boy under you," Clove barked, his voice devoid of panic, but laced with a lethal, icy calm. He kicked the heavy oak table over, dragging it in front of the bed to create a crude barricade. He shoved Wynne behind it. Samuel, terrified by the sudden noise and rough handling, began to wail. Wynne clamped a trembling hand over his small head, pressing his face into her shoulder to muffle the sound, her own breath coming in ragged, terrified gasps. Outside, the heavy thud of boots hit the porch of the way station. Then came a voice that made Wynne's blood run entirely cold. "Abby, honey, you in there?" It was Josiah. His voice didn't hold the terror it had in the desert. It was sickeningly smooth, coated in the false charm he used when he was holding a winning hand. "Josiah," Wynne whispered, the word tasting like ash in her mouth. Clove pressed his back against the wall beside the shattered window, his Colt revolver cocked and held near his cheek. "That your husband?" he whispered back, his grey eyes locked on her. Wynne nodded, tears of sheer, disbelieving rage welling in her eyes. "He brought them here. I told them you didn't know nothing about the money, Abby." Josiah called out, his voice echoing in the dusty evening air. "Mister, Higgins here. He's a reasonable man. He just wants what's his. You toss out that quilt, and I swear to you, we ride away. Nobody gets hurt. I'll even come in and fetch you and the boy." "He's lying," a gruff, gravelly voice interrupted. This voice belonged to a man who didn't negotiate. Wynne recognized the name from Josiah's terrified ramblings, Dutch Higgins. "Shut your mouth, Miller. Lady, you got 10 seconds to throw that bundle out the door. You don't. We burn this station down with you and the bastard inside." Wynne looked at the quilt on the bed, still spilling its stolen fortune. She looked at Clove. She was no longer the naive, trusting girl who had boarded a train in Ohio. The desert had burned that girl away. "What do we do?" she asked, her voice steadying. "We don't trust a man who leaves his family for the buzzards," Clove said grimly. He reached to his gun belt, pulling out a heavy, pearl-handled Remington revolver and sliding it across the floorboards to her. "You know how to use that." "No," she admitted. "Thumb the hammer back. Point." "Squeeze," Clove instructed, his eyes never leaving the window. "Only shoot if they clear that doorway. Time's up, Miller." Higgins roared from outside. "Light it." "No. Wait, Dutch. Please." Josiah's voice pitched upward in sudden panic. "You said you wouldn't hurt her." A heavy thud and a groan indicated Josiah had just been struck with the butt of a rifle. Suddenly, the warm orange glow of a torch flared outside the window. Clove didn't hesitate. He pivoted around the window frame and fired twice into the twilight. A man screamed, the torch dropping to the dry porch planks, instantly catching the wood on fire. A barrage of return fire ripped through the front of the building. The air inside the room filled with the choking, acrid scent of sulfur and burning wood. "We can't stay here." Clove coughed, the smoke already beginning to pool against the ceiling. "They're gonna smoke us out like badgers." "There's no back door." Wynne panicked, looking around the small, trap-like room. Clove's eyes scanned the floorboards. "Most of these frontier stations got a root cellar for the winter. Move." He scrambled across the floor, running his hands over the rough-hewn planks until his fingers caught on a recessed iron ring. He heaved upward. With a groan of rusted hinges, a square section of the floor lifted, revealing a pitch-black, dirt-smelling abyss. "Go. Take the boy. Go down." Clove ordered. Wynne didn't hesitate. Clutching Samuel tightly to her chest with one arm, she awkwardly lowered herself into the darkness, her boots finding a steep wooden ladder. The cellar was small, damp, and smelled of rotting potatoes and damp earth. But it was safe from the bullets tearing through the room above. Clove grabbed the oilcloth quilt, quickly stuffing the stacks of money and the Montana deed back into the lining. He rolled it tight, threw it down the hatch, and then followed, pulling the heavy trapdoor shut just as the room above them was fully engulfed in flames. The silence in the cellar was heavy, broken only by Samuel's whimpers and the muffled roar of the fire raging above. Dust drifted down through the cracks in the ceiling. They'll wait for the fire to burn down to search the ashes for the gold, Clove whispered in the dark, his hand finding Win's shoulder in the pitch black. His touch was firm, grounding her. There's got to be a storm hatch, a way out the back to the stables. He struck a match, the sudden flare illuminating the cramped space. He moved toward the back wall, his hands feeling along the damp dirt until he found a slanted wooden door held shut by a heavy timber beam. "Stand back," Clove muttered. He lifted the beam, his muscles straining, and pushed the doors open. Cool night air rushed in, carrying the smell of sage and horse manure. They were directly behind the way station, concealed by the darkness and the thick smoke billowing from the front of the building. The sound of Higgins' men shouting and the crackle of flames masked their escape. "To the stables," Clove whispered. "We take my horses. The wagon is too slow." They moved like ghosts through the shadows. The heat of the burning station was at their backs as they slipped into the large timber barn. Clove's two massive draft horses and his saddle horse were stomping nervously in their stalls, smelling the smoke. Clove moved quickly, grabbing a saddle and throwing it over his fastest roan. "I'm going to put you and the boy on the horse. I'll ride bareback behind you." "Well, ain't this a touching family portrait?" The voice came from the shadows near the tack room. Clove froze, his hand dropping to his sidearm. Win gasped. Spinning around, stepping out from behind a stack of hay bales, was Josiah. His face was bruised and bleeding from where Higgins's men had struck him, and his eyes were wild with a desperate, manic light. In his trembling hand, he held a Colt peacemaker, pointed directly at Win's chest. "Josiah," Win whispered, her pulse pounding as the truth settled in. Clove's voice cut low and steady through the tension. "Don't do it. You pull that trigger. You won't walk away." But Josiah was beyond reason. His hands trembled, his eyes wild with desperation. "I don't want trouble," he insisted. "Just the money. Give it to me, and I'll disappear before sunrise." "You already disappeared," Win said coldly. "The moment you left your own son to die." Something in her shifted. Fear drained away, replaced by clarity. The man in front of her was no longer her husband, just a stranger consumed by greed. "Give me the quilt," Josiah snapped, raising the gun. Now Win stepped back, clutching Samuel, her voice unshakable. "No." For a heartbeat, everything froze. Then Josiah pulled the trigger. The shot came, but not from him. Thunder cracked through the barn. Win flinched, but the pain never came. Instead, Josiah staggered, a dark stain spreading across his chest. He collapsed, lifeless, his weapon slipping from his horn. Clove stood firm, smoke curling from his revolver. Silence followed. "I'm sorry," Clove said quietly, his voice stripped of its usual hardness. "I didn't want you to carry that." Win looked at the body, feeling nothing but emptiness. "He was already gone," she murmured. Shouts echoed outside. "The danger wasn't over. We ride now." Within moments, they were gone, racing into the Wyoming night, leaving fire and violence behind. For 2 days, they rode without rest, avoiding roads, pushing toward safety, under endless stars. They spoke not of fear, but of loss. Shared grief slowly turned into something steadier, something real. At Fort Bridger, the truth finally surfaced. Clove presented the stolen money and the story behind it. Win confirmed every word. The judge listened, then delivered his verdict. The criminals had been captured, the money returned, and for their part, Wynne would receive the reward. $5,000. A fortune. Outside. Wynne stood in the sunlight, still trying to believe it. Clove waited nearby, holding Samuel. "You're free now," he said. "You and the boy can start over." But Wynne shook her head. "I don't want to run anymore," she said softly. "I want a home." She met his eyes. "And I don't want to build it alone." For a long moment, Clove said nothing. Then something in him, something long buried, finally gave way. "I know a place," he said. A year later, that place became everything. A home, a family, a future built not from fear but from survival, trust, and something far stronger than either of them had ever expected. Did Wynne and Clove's journey from the brutal Wyoming desert to a life of hard-won love captivate your heart? Don't let the story end here. Hit that like button, share this thrilling Wild West saga with your friends, and subscribe to our channel for more incredible tales of survival, betrayal, and untamed romance. Saddle up and join our community. Your next great frontier adventure is just a click away.